he could insist upon handing over parts of those areas which are not already under Russian control. I can't see Ukraine ever agreeing to that, because it would be about signing over millions of their population to live under Russia, which is what they've been loads of their young people have been fighting and dying for. But that's the kind of, so if he's wanting more than that territory which he already claims, which he hasn't even got yet, then that's an extraordinary amount of Ukraine, and he doesn't have the firepower to get it. So if that's any way near on the cards, then he's done extraordinary sort of mind games with Trump to make him, if Trump doesn't realize that this is complete make-uppery. And it's also very concerning for Ukraine, because they're struggling to hold this sort of 600-mile front.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And this time we are joined by Assistant Foreign News Editor at the Times and Sunday Times, Jack Clover. Jack reports regularly from Ukraine, and he's just back from his latest assignment. Jack, good to see you. Thank you so much for spending some time with us right now. While you were in Ukraine, Donald Trump's ceasefire negotiations delivered an almost daily political bombshell, certainly as far as the media was concerned. Currently, Putin and Zelensky have said they will stop aerial bombardments, but neither has done so. And regardless, President Zelensky now says lasting peace is achievable, he believes, this year with American support. Is that what they think in Ukraine?
I think there's a sense that peace is closer now than it has been over the past 3 years. That there are certain events that are falling together that mean that it does feel a little bit closer. It is not as close as it seems when you read the news. In Ukraine, for them, it's like a parallel world, a parallel universe. That's something that I've been hearing a lot in the past 2 to 3 weeks. The talks of ceasefire, the talks of last night. I mean, I was in Ukraine this morning. There were still air alerts in 3 or 4 oblasts or regions last night, despite the noises that we're getting from the Kremlin about them being open to stopping strikes on energy infrastructure. I mean, there is no, in Ukraine, they live in a reality whereby since 2014, they've established that they can't trust Russia. And I think the rest of the world will be mindful to remember that we also have been lied to by Russia, even not regarding Ukraine with the Salisbury poisonings and various other occasions. So, I mean, it feels a bit like it's a parallel universe at the moment over there.
Parallel universe. And recent proposals from Trump include trading ownership or running of Ukrainian power plants to ensure US security, because a US presence there, he believes, means that Ukraine will be safer. And this comes after he alluded to negotiations with Putin about dividing up assets in Ukraine. I mean, if he's talking about Zaporizhzhia, which a lot of people are assuming he does, I mean, is that viable? And what kind of reaction do you get when you hear those kind of proposals?
Well, if we're talking about Zaporizhzhia power plant now, this is the situation that it's in. It is on a front line, on the bank of a marshland that's been drained by the bombing of a dam, with loads of kind of dirt for miles around, surrounded with munitions that have been littered there over the past 3 years. It's on its last legs in terms of a sort of a trickle of power going through to it. It would need a lot of restoring to get it back up and running again. And also, at the moment, it's an occupied territory. And the idea that Russia's going to give that back or to America instead of to Ukraine, at the moment, is just noise. It's an extraordinary thing to say. There's no doubt about that. It's an extraordinary thing to say. It feels like it's a continuation of the narrative around the mineral deal. When we saw the wording of that, when Zelensky flew for that kind of striking Oval Office shouting match, the wording wasn't necessarily that bad for Ukraine. It was really quite open. And it could have been quite a clever kind of joint investment fund that lets Trump do something America firsty, but actually isn't the end of the world for Ukraine. Now, with all this talk of sort of, we want to have these power plants to be under American control, I don't know if even the Ukrainians can see the wood from the trees here about what America's game is and what they want in the long term. It's a little bit too early to say, but basically, I think it's clear that Trump wants to have some form of economic gain from whatever pressure he's been putting on Ukraine to secure peace.
Let's talk, Jack, about some of the focus of your recent reporting from Ukraine. You reported from Sumy, close to the border with Russia, and where within hours of Putin agreeing to a cessation of aerial bombardments, hospitals were targeted. How tense is it in Sumy at the moment?
It's a bit surreal in Sumy. On the road into the town, you see lines and lines of defences. It looks like sort of something from the First World War. You see trenches, you see pillboxes, um, you see lots of military vehicles, etc. When you get there, they're living the same life they've been living since for the past 3 years in the city itself. Um, uh, they're still under the risk of glide bombs, which is worse than a lot of cities in Ukraine because they're only the ones which are closer to the border have this threat, and they're extraordinarily powerful and terrifying. But when it comes down to artillery and the smaller FPV drones, they're still not within reach there. However, just about 10 kilometers further north or further east, further towards the border, I was speaking with people in villages there who've had to flee. They've been forced evacuated in recent weeks. The Russian onslaught has been extraordinary. 11 glide bombs in 24 hours, one woman told me. Civilians being killed on the street indiscriminately. Anything that moves in terms of in a vehicle is treated like a military vehicle, and the Russians bomb it. So it's the kind of nearer to the border there. It's the kind of the horrendous scenes that we saw in 2022 happening again. The Ukraine is still holding on in one or two villages in Kursk region. They're not surrounded, as far as we can tell, but there is a weakness there that in the haste of that retreat, there will be some weaknesses in the line, and Russia will be able to push over into that part of northeastern Ukraine.
And did you get a sense of how much damage the withholding of that American intelligence caused? Were you there at the time? Did you get a sense of how much damage it did in that particular area?
I spoke with kind of intelligence officers who had knowledge of the Kursk operation. They said that it was one of the contributing factors to that retreat. So you don't want to overblow it and say that was what did it, but it was the uncertainty that made the biggest difference. The fact that the soldiers on the ground didn't know, oh, does that mean that we need to start economizing on the number of shells we're firing? Do we need to start making choices about, oh, we don't hit all four of those armored vehicles, we'll just hit the biggest ones? And the soldier told me that, whenever you're starting to think of economy when you're in a life and death scenario, it's not a great sign. There's also was effects on the way that they could some of the drone sighting and the targeting technology for some of the more high tech drones that they were using in the Kursk region as well. So it definitely had an effect, but it was a combination of factors in that offensive. These incredibly brutal and experienced Russian units were being moved from the Donbas up to the north to push in that area. You've also got these very disciplined and effective North Korean troops, and it all just fell together to be a bit too much for the Ukrainian soldiers who are there.
And in terms of the Russian advance and the reclaiming of land in Kursk and its objectives over the border, how vulnerable is Sumy feeling at the moment, and how well defended is it?
I mean, that you hear the sentence that you hear quite often when you're reporting on this war. When you talk to civilians, they say, "I trust in the armed forces of Ukraine. I believe that they won't come into the town." But of course, they are worried. Of course, they are terrified. People are starting to think, in 2022, Sumy was in a bizarre situation. Russian forces came over the border to the west and to the east of the town, and were basically surrounding the town, but they didn't want to capture it because they were heading for Kiev, or they're heading via Chernihiv to Kiev. And so Sumy was basically in this bizarre surrounded scenario, and a lot of people fled at that time. And now a lot of people are considering doing that again because of the nature of the onslaught. I mean, at the moment, the lines move a lot slower than they did back then because of the nature of the defences. So whether or not people can stay for longer and their lives will be changed, that they're already living with this threat of glide bombs and of ballistic missiles and of Shahed drones. So whether or not their lives will change markedly in the next 2 or 3 weeks, it's yet to be seen. But if they are pushing on those lines, then it will be a matter of time before perhaps Sumy will come under artillery range, and that would be devastating. So I'm sure that people there will be thinking about that. But at the moment, that people are still putting on plays in the theatre. People are still going to cafes and busking out on the street, and it's slightly surreal for us to understand. But it's still a vibrant, thriving city, but it's definitely a sense of nervousness. I mean, they closed it off for most foreign journalists very, very quickly last week, and people were a bit confused about there was very limited access to the whole region. And so, yes, there's definitely something afoot there, and it's quite concerning.
And Jack, it has been suggested that there will be no full ceasefire until Russia has achieved its objectives on the battlefield, like routing Ukraine from Kursk. What did the troops you met tell you about the kind of pressure they're under for the newly arrived Russian reinforcements there?
I mean, they used quite fruity language when they talked about the situation. The morale was surprisingly high. They said that the kind of mixed messaging from the US definitely dented the morale, and that sense of uncertainty, and the sense that Trump's basically bought into quite a lot of Putin's narratives about the war. That definitely dented people's morale. In terms of their fight, their attitude is quite simple, that this is a total war and they want to basically eradicate the Ukrainian state, and I'd rather fight and die here than be under a pro-Russian Ukrainian regime, which would basically call me a terrorist and lock me up and send me to a Siberian jail. So for them, there's literally no choice. All this idea of like Russia's war objectives being to, we want to push them out of Kursk. This is just absolute obfuscation. This is obviously my opinion, but it's also what the opinion of a lot of the soldiers there. This is just obfuscation and madness. Russia's war aims from the beginning has been to install a pro-Russian government in Ukraine and demilitarize it. And basically make it into a puppet state. Those aims haven't changed. Those aims haven't changed in 3 years. They've just been bad at achieving those aims. So this is what Ukrainian soldiers are feeling now, is that just sort of, well, why do we suddenly think that, they only want to have the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Donbas, or they only want us to get out of Kursk and then they'll have a ceasefire? In their view, is that they don't believe that the Ukrainian state should exist, and that they won't stop until they've achieved those aims, even if it's not, they have a ceasefire and then in 5 years' time they'll try and take the rest of the country. That's how everyone sees it, basically.
Yeah, and Jack, I'm going to ask you a bit more about what you've learned about the experience of people living in the Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine in a moment. But before that, just want to get your perspective on these reports that Ukraine has conducted an incursion, however small, in Belgorod Oblast in Russia. Did you see any kind of preparations for that, or have any knowledge, hear any rumours while you were there?
I heard on Tuesday morning about this. There are the occasional sabotage groups going over the border on both sides, but this sounds relatively significant because 24 hours later, it was further more kind of concrete reports. There's a suggestion that they're still there, even though the Russians say that they pushed them back. So, I mean, at the moment, this is how the Kursk operation started, to be honest, in terms of the news, the way that it's come out. However, I don't think it's nearly as big as that. But what they might have been doing is try to go across the border, try to seize a village, try to create some form of buffer zone there as a further pressure on that front, because between the Sumy region, oblast, and the the Kharkiv Oblast, and they're opposite the Kursk and the Belgorod Oblast in Russia. This is where the most active bit of the front is at the moment. And the Russians have pushed over a bit of the Kharkiv border. The Ukrainians pushed over a bit in Kursk. And now they've been pushed back in Kursk, so the Ukrainians are trying to push forward somewhere else. And so this is basically, as far as I see, a way to divert the attention of those experienced units that have been moved north from the Donbas, who, if they're concentrated in one point on the Sumy region in the areas that have been pushed back in Kursk after the retreat from Kursk, it could be a big problem for Ukraine. And so they're trying to divert them. That's how I see it. I don't know how major this report is yet, but it does seem like it shows that this battlefield is really active, regardless of what is more active than it has been in 18 months or so, or maybe less than that, maybe since the Kursk offensive for at least. But like the fact that these negotiations are going on as if it's a frozen conflict is bizarre.
Yeah, and we're talking on Thursday, late on Thursday afternoon, and there may be more information that comes out between now and this actually being published, but really good to hear your thoughts and your take on that. Let's talk about Kherson Oblast, which has suffered greatly from the conflict and from occupation as well. Can you just outline to us the division of Kherson and how much of it is currently occupied?
So Kherson is a region of Ukraine named after the city of Kherson, which was occupied by Russia in 2022. By the end of that year, the Ukrainians have managed to sort of cut them off and push them back to the extent that they retreated back across the river. So Ukraine has the control of half of the region. They've got the control of the city. When they liberated Kherson, they found out quite a lot of things about what the Russians were doing in that city. But the other side of the river, this is a vast river at this point. We're getting towards the kind of the Dnipro Delta, in towards the Black Sea. It's very wide, but on the other side of the river, there are Russian forces, and they're constantly shelling across the river. They're constantly sending FPV drones, which my colleague Anthony Lloyd did a brilliant piece on how they're systematically targeting civilians in Kherson, trying to go about by their day-to-day business, and they're getting bombed by these FPV drones because the Russians are sitting across the other side of the river. What we don't know is what life is like on the other side of the river, and that's what is quite chilling. Some of the things that we managed to hear.
Yeah, and that's what you want to try and find out about, isn't it? How did you go about it, and what did you learn?
Well, it's very sensitive because, I mean, I can't talk about how or who we spoke to in a sense, because those who speak with Western media could be locked up. But we found voices of people who have had knowledge of what's happening in that region very, very recently, and today, basically. So people who have knowledge of what's happening there, and they reported, which was confirmed by a couple of other sources, that there were still bodies on the street. Some of these were from the dam explosion of the Novokhovka Dam, which then flooded the town of Oleshki in the Russian-held area. The Russians have been accused of underplaying the number of deaths. Independent reporters speaking to local officials put it at around 200-300, maybe more. And they didn't do anything to clear it up. That's what we've been hearing from people. So this is 18 months ago, more than 18 months ago, almost 2 years ago now. So there are still bodies there. There are also, closer to the river, there's a suggestion that it's an active conflict there. So there are loads of Russian soldiers, basically a law unto their own. And if you are a civilian still living in one of these villages, it's a pretty desperate situation because you don't have any access to any services. There isn't any law other than the kind of the barrel of a gun. And we've heard pretty shocking reports of extrajudicial killings and of rape. There is much more to find out about what's happening there, but this definitely felt like the most. I mean, the situation in all of the occupied territories of Ukraine are pretty grim. There is no democracy there. There is no rule of law by what we would call a rule of law. That there's, people are sentenced to long political exile and long sentences for voicing dissent. But in places like Kherson, it feels much darker than that. I mean, because you're so close to the front that it's just basically run by, it's lawless entirely. So there's a different picture in different parts of this of occupied Ukraine. Yeah.
And contributing to this climate of fear which people must be living under in those areas are these mysterious deaths of Russian collaborators and Soviet-style purges. What more can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so we spoke with the former head of a group of villages in the Zaporizhzhia region. So that's the adjacent region to the Kherson region. And he spoke of how a group of people who were some of the first in the area to welcome the Russians. There were a few of them, but there were people who welcomed the Russians. And there were also people who were installed by the Russians from other areas. And there'd been mysterious deaths in the past 2 months of lots of people. It was about 7 or 8 in his area alone. And one of these deaths, a man who was shot outside his business, caused a furor and the beginning of what he called a kind of black terror, where the security services went village to village to try and figure out who had done it. In his opinion, it was actually the Russian security services themselves who had killed this individual, and maybe as part of a row over him not paying a bribe that was agreed or falling out with someone. But that what's quite striking is just the level of chaos and fear. Basically, the only way that they run, they seem to be able to run these parts of Ukraine is through fear. It's basically, if you don't do what we say, then we're going to find a way to send you to the front, or we'll lock you up, and often that will involve torturing. So it's a pretty it's a pretty grim scenario for anyone who is still pro-Ukraine over there.
And it's really interesting that you say that there's a real climate of chaos in fear in these areas. And Putin has repeatedly stated that territory currently occupied by Russia must stay that way, in his view, and be accepted as being de facto Russian. How is he executing this kind of plan of complete transformation and absorption of these territories into Russia, both, ethnically, politically, culturally? I mean, is there a long-term plan in his head, or is he leaving it as it is in terms of the chaos and the disorder? Or is there a transition period in his view, in his planning?
Well, I think part of the chaos and the disorder is down to some of the dysfunctionalities of the Russian state. In terms of his plan is more systematic. It's to give everyone Russian passports, make it basically illegal to not have one, or not necessarily illegal, but incredibly hard to go about your day-to-day business. You can't go to school, you can't get a house, you can't do all the things that you need to do to operate in society unless you have a Russian passport. And then if you have a Russian passport, you're then saying, oh, this area is a Russian area because there aren't any ethnic Ukrainians. Even just today, he announced a new law saying that people with Ukrainian citizenships across the whole of Russia need to sort of hand them over or change them or make them legal ASAP. And what he decides is legal and not legal is up for grabs. I mean, at least 3 million Ukrainians lived in Russia in 2018 before the war, and then quite a few refugees moved there after the siege of places like Mariupol. So there's lots of Ukrainians in Russia voluntarily, some of them, but it looks like he's even trying to make those Ukrainians who might be either apolitical or even for Russia, just to get rid of their Ukrainian nationality. So that's one way. There's also the nefarious stealing of children, which we've been reported. It's quite extraordinary, the numbers that have been taken from occupied areas, some kind of orphanages, or what they call more like children's homes, and from schools and occupied areas into other places in Russia. Senior figures within the Russian government have adopted Ukrainian children from these areas. It's basically to sort of stop them from being Ukrainian anymore. And Russia has done this in the past in other places. But this is quite an extraordinary example of this. Basically, it comes from a mindset that is popular within the the Russian establishment at the moment, the more extreme elements of it, which is that Ukraine doesn't exist. It's a Russian state which has gone astray, and we need to pull them back by force, basically.
And there was a report in the Russian newspaper Kommersant that Putin threatened to expand his ambitions beyond the current occupied areas in Ukraine if there isn't official recognition of them. What hope is there for the upcoming talks in Saudi next week if his demands increase unchecked as they are doing, no matter what concessions President Zelensky makes?
Putin lives in his own reality. And it's interesting to think about the extent to which he himself believes his own propaganda. According to Russia, all five, Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson are all part of the Russian Federation, according to their constitution now. In the case of Kherson and Zaporizhzhia, only half of those regions are occupied by Russia. But in the Russian constitution, all of them are part of Russia. So when I'm in Zaporizhzhia speaking to people with Ukrainian flags who are, pro-Ukrainian, there are lots of soldiers there fighting to keep that Ukrainian-held territory. In Russian constitution, that is Russia. So they live in another world of reality. Also, this is the kind of thing that Russia could use in the future for justifying the end of the ceasefire, for example, if that there was any violence in these areas, they'll say that this is part of Russia, or he could insist upon handing over parts of those areas which are not already under Russian control. I can't see Ukraine ever agreeing to that, because it would be about signing over millions of their population to live under Russia, which is what they've been loads of their young people have been fighting and dying for. But that's the kind of, so if he's wanting more than that territory which he already claims, which he hasn't even got yet, then that's an extraordinary amount of Ukraine, and he doesn't have the firepower to get it. So if that's any way near on the cards, then he's done extraordinary sort of mind games with Trump to make him, if Trump doesn't realize that this is complete make-uppery. And it's also very concerning for Ukraine, because they're struggling to hold this sort of 600-mile front.
That unforgettable treatment of President Zelensky at the Oval Office by Donald Trump, at the time, it's had the immediate effect of uniting the public behind him and even opposition politicians. What is the situation at the moment?
One of the most common things you hear is, I didn't vote for Zelensky, but I back him now, or I don't like seeing that kind of humiliation, because they're humiliating us. And especially about him not wearing a suit. Soldiers I spoke to said, we understand. Does he not understand why he's not wearing a suit? He's not wearing a suit because he's showing solidarity with us. In terms of, it's been a bit of a kind of roller coaster in the past 2 or 3 weeks, because we started with the Oval Office row when I first arrived in Ukraine. It was looking into this new world of, oh my God, maybe the US are completely going to abandon Ukraine and maybe even side with the enemy. We're not that far away from that now, because Trump's clearly not playing very hardball with Putin when he's on the phone call yesterday. But at the moment, a lot of people on the ground just don't really know how to take it. It's a bit of a mix.
Jack, just finally, from a personal point of view, you're somebody who's lived several years in Ukraine yourself after the invasion of Crimea, but you lived through very different times in the country. What is it like for you seeing what's happening now and going back to report on it?
It's both heartening and upsetting at the same time. It's exactly the same Ukraine that I know. It's the same friends that I know. It's the same cities that I know. But it's really distressing to see what they have to live with every day. And I mean, I've got acquaintances that who signed up and died. It's quite, I mean, I was in Sumy on the day that Zelensky was elected in 2019. It's bizarre that over 5 years later, this man who was at the time, everyone was really worried about him because he was talking a little bit soft on Russia and talking a little bit soft on defending Ukraine. And a lot of my friends who are a bit more, they were kind of pro-Europe, and they worried that this guy was going to slide back towards sort of post-Soviet mentality. It's bizarre that they've all rallied around him in the past recent weeks. And it's also upsetting to see. I was speaking to other friends in Lviv last night, where I also used to live, and they were saying how this sort of feels. I haven't felt like this since before the full-scale invasion in 2022, because of the nature of the uncertainty. Like, they kind of knew what the grinding but nasty day-to-day was for the past 2 years or so. But all of this talk and the way that the America is talking to Russia behind Ukraine's back, they really feel, other than those who are fighting in the army who are not powerless, they're doing what they can. But there's a sense of like absolute awe and shock, and I could say dismay, but Ukrainians aren't very big on dismay. They're just they're taking with it quite a lot of humor, but they're not planning anything. They don't know what's going to happen to their family. They don't know what's going to happen to their homes. They don't know what's going to happen to their future, and they worry that, you know, there's almost a feeling that they're closer towards some form of quasi Russian occupation now than they were several months ago, because of the nature of the kind of demands and the kind of deals that Trump and Putin seem to be doing. So it's heartening and upsetting at the same time, basically.
Thank you, Jack. I look forward to seeing your reports. You've got some coming up soon.
I've done most of them now, but I've got a few things in my notebook. It was all quite rushed, so it was all kind of, you don't have time, write it now. So
okay, I'm sure you'll be back to Ukraine soon, so we'll look forward to seeing what you bring from the next reporting trip. Really good to speak to you, Jack Clover. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you. Good to see you.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. If you'd like to know more about the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe and sign up for a membership. You can also get more analysis by listening to Times Radio or read thetimes.com. But for now, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.